I feel like it's not a great sign for the show when I'm trying to write an episode about tariffs, and the only clip I can find is one from Ferris Bueller's Day Off. You know the one.
Anyone? Anyone?
Well, I'm going to choose to ignore that and pretend that tariffs are exciting, because you know what? Damn it, the entire economy could depend on it. Today we dive into tariffs, the history of tariffs, the new tariffs, and why the chip dip industrial complex may never be the same again. From Battleborn Progress, this is Battleborn Bytes. My name is Jacob, and as the French Canadians say, allez-vous? So I actually have no idea if they say that in Quebec, which is a shame because I am half Quebecois. That's not a joke, I'm really half Quebecois. But would it be Battleborn Bytes if I didn't start an episode with a quick history lesson? Trick question, the answer is no, obviously. So real quick, what is a tariff definitionally? It's just an import tax. You want to import, I don't know, limes or maple syrup or a car door. Pay 5% at the door, buddy, before passing go. It's important to remember that at the beginning of this country's history, there are basically no income taxes. And I say basically, there are no income taxes. It's not constitutional yet. So all of the federal government's revenue comes from tariffs and excise taxes, but we're ignoring that for today. For several hundred years, this raises a modest amount of revenue for the federal government, but never really more than about 5% of the US GDP at any given point in time. However, tariffs frequently become proxy battles for all kinds of issues of the day in the middle of the 1800s and into the 1900s. This is a little bit of a tangent, but frankly, there's probably no better example of this than something called the Tariff of Abominations. So this one tariff almost triggers a civil war before the Civil War. So in 1828, Congress levies this thing called the Tariff of 1828, aptly named. This was designed to protect farmers, but it also meant that buying stuff in the South was extraordinarily more expensive, making Southerners very upset. This triggers then Vice President John C. Calhoun to write anonymously that states should try this thing called nullification. What is nullification? Just take a federal law you don't like and pretend it's not real. Job's done. This is a problem because the federal government does not like this. This starts spiraling out of control into something called the nullification crisis, up to the point that South Carolina literally starts arming itself to prevent the collection of these tariffs. But in a rare W for President Andrew Jackson, he says, no, you are not actually allowed to nullify laws from Congress. That is tantamount to disunion, and disunion by force is tantamount to treason. It is times like this that I'm reminded there really is a drill tweet for everything. And here's another fun fact before we move on. Andrew Jackson was actually asked if he had any regrets before he died, and he only had two, that he didn't shoot Henry Clay and didn't hang John C. Calhoun. What a time to be alive. Although I guess, parallels to the modern day, parallels. So into the late 1800s and into the early 1900s during the Industrial Revolution, tariffs in the US start high and basically stay high. This is because of protectionism, basically protect tiny baby industries in America so they don't get gobbled up by bigger industries elsewhere. As a result, basically through World War II, the United States has some of the highest tariffs anywhere in the world, often averaging 30 or 40%, and sometimes hitting as high as 50 or 60%. Well, why did tariffs stop going up, you ask? Well, that's because sometimes you pass a tariff so big that everything goes really wrong now, doesn't it? That brings us to Smoot-Hawley. Well, remember Ferris Bueller? This was what the teacher's talking about.
The Hawley-Smoot Tariff Act.
In 1930, Congress passes the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, bumping tariffs all the way up to 60%. This is very high, and it also happens in the middle of the Great Depression. It was designed in order to protect American industry because the Depression was happening. Turns out, might not have been the best idea. Coupled with a real soup of monetary and banking policy failures that were happening exactly at the same time, they do call it the Great Depression after all. Imports and exports collapse, Wall Street continues its nosedive, and other governments institute retaliatory tariffs against the United States. Whatever they were trying to do with Smoot-Hawley, I think we can safely say they didn't do it. They missed the mark. And because we have to keep moving, I'm going to skip over some stuff. So after World War II, everyone starts signing free trade agreements, and stuff happens. We end up at today. So speaking plainly, I don't think it takes an economist to realize that the way that the Trump administration has rolled out these new tariffs has been a mess. One of the reasons why it's been such a mess is that by the time you watch this video, some of the information I'm giving you is already going to be out of date. Certainly, something's gonna happen. But you know what? Here goes, quick recap. Tariffs were a key part of the Trump campaign 2.0. He kept saying that, let's increase tariffs so other countries can pay for tax cuts. Here's a funny thing, though. Wall Street basically didn't believe him when he said this because economists across the political spectrum basically said the same thing. When you institute a tariff, it is not the other country that pays for it, it's the consumer that pays for it. So everyone was like, oh, well, he wouldn't actually do this, would he? Flash forward to now, surprise, the tariffs are real. The tariffs are definitely real, and no one is particularly happy about it. This is because despite how many times Trump says that consumers aren't paying for these tariffs, that other countries are paying for these tariffs, it's just literally not true. And you may notice this by the way that prices have gone up, not down. Weird. It is weird how that works. Real-time fact checked. Wow. So Trump has even said that he wants these tariffs to help pay for tax cuts that he wants to make in the rest of his agenda. But if that were true, why are Republicans cutting Medicaid in order to pay for, let me check my notes, these same tax cuts? We may never know the answers to these questions, folks. But whether tariffs are real for 24 hours or 48 hours seems to depend on whether or not Mercury is in retrograde. For all my astrologers in the chat, that one was for you. For instance, Trump announced initial 25% tariffs on Canada, Mexico, and China in early February, but he backed off on the Canada and Mexico parts of that before they even took effect. Flash forward 2 weeks later, and he decides to implement tariffs on steel and aluminum anyways. Now we get to the beginning of this month, last week I guess, and Trump says, surprise, the Mexico-Canada tariffs are back and they're real for sure this time. Except 1 day later, he decides that they aren't real. Actually, he's gonna exempt car manufacturers because the big 3 automakers freaked out. Then suddenly it's 48 hours later and he says, you know what, I'm going to pause the Canada and Mexico tariffs for 1 month, but they're coming back in April, you better believe. I know I was going to do them in February and then I didn't do them, and then I said I was going to do them in March and then I didn't do them, but in April, and I'm not doing it on April Fool's Day, he said that. He said he's going to do it on April 2nd, so everyone knows it's not a joke. Not a joke, folks. But as recently as literally right before I started recording this, Trump changed his tune again and has decided to implement additional 25% tariffs from Canadian steel and aluminum for the vibes, presumably. So it is genuinely impossible to guess where any of this ends up. Sometimes it's not immediately clear how international trade policy affects you at the end of the day. People will be like, ooh, the Dow's down 1,000 points, don't check your 401k. Joke's on you, I never check my 401k. So I think it's helpful to pause for a moment to think about the necessities that someone in, say, Las Vegas might have, and how tariffs affect that stuff. According to the FDA, about 15% of the American food supply is imported from other countries. Of that, almost 2/3 of vegetables come from Mexico, and almost half of fruits and nuts also come from Mexico. So that means everything from limes to avocados to basically every ingredient of guac could just get more expensive. But you've also probably heard a lot, including in this very video, about the way that tariffs can impact the cost of cars. Why is that? Well, it's because since the 90s, the United States, Canada, and Mexico have created this big mesh network of how to build cars. Through first the North American Free Trade Agreement and later the US-Mexico-Canada Agreement, basically a car or parts of a car can pass through Canada, Mexico, and the United States up to 6 times before you get an actual car out of the deal. Guess how many times a tariff is applied to that car? It's every time. Because of that, car makers warned last week that the cost of a finished car in the United States could jump 25%, which is crazy because the median cost of a car in the US is already well over $40,000, so woo. But look, this goes beyond just stuff like limes or car doors. If we look at something that has stuck around, something like those steel and aluminum tariffs, then we can look at stuff like computer prices. Maybe this outs me as a big nerd, but anyone who's built their own computer can probably tell you right now that they're extremely annoyed at the price of a graphics card, which has spiked because of supply issues, but also because of tariffs. But it's not just those high-end PC components that are getting more expensive. It's all the cheaper stuff too. Want to buy a new iPhone? Guess what? Tariffs made it more expensive. Excited for the Nintendo Switch 2?
believe it or not.
Tariffs. And then there's this tariff domino effect, where industries you never even think about start getting affected and lose revenue, and suddenly the state loses tax revenue, and suddenly everyone's freaking out. What could this be, you ask? Well, this week the Nevada Independent reported that the slot machine industry is increasingly concerned that Canadian provinces could follow the lead of Alberta, which this week banned US-made slot machines. Take a wild guess where some of these slot machine companies are based. Butterfly effect indeed. But in the interest of not dating the show any further than we have already, we're going to have to leave it there for now, and that does it for today's show. If you like what we're doing, maybe give it a like, subscribe, and make sure that you're first to know when we upload a new episode. But until next time, this has been Battleborn Bytes. We'll see you next week.